Well, welcome everybody to another edition of ILA's webinar series. My name is Phil Wilburn. I'm a ILA member, and I'll be your moderator today. As many of you know, this is just one of the mini series of webinars that ILA does. Today's webinar is sponsored by the ILA Business Member Interest Group, the Business MIG. To learn more about the Business MIG and other member communities, please visit ila-net.org or visit us on ILA Space. I'm very excited today to be introducing Don Dunoon. He's coming to us live from Sydney, Australia. I believe it is 12 midnight his time, so we got to appreciate him staying up late on his side to join us. It's 10 a.m. my time. He is the author of the book, The Leadership Mode. It's been described, this book, in the January 2009 edition of Integral Leadership Reviews, as groundbreaking. Since the book was published early last year, it's gained quite a bit of international press. It's very practical with a good theoretical basis. This is why the Business MIG thought it would be such a good idea for a webinar. He presented at ILA last year in Los Angeles and was at the author signing. I believe the name of his presentation was Rephrasing Leadership in its Relationship with Management from a Learning Perspective. Heard it had really great reviews. Unfortunately, I didn't get to make it, but we'll make it next year in Prague. And he has been in the field of leadership development and learning for the past 15 years. Again, this webinar is sponsored by the Business MIG. I'm a member of the Business MIG, and I'm going to be the moderator today. How we're going to do this is Don would like to have this as interactive as possible through webinar, but we're going to be doing question and answer format through the GoToMeetings. There's a submit a question function on your GoToMeetings panel. We would like you to submit questions that way. And then every 10 to 15 minutes or so, Don's going to be stopping, and I'm going to be presenting to him the questions from what you've submitted, and he's going to be answering them. So feel free to submit as many questions as possible. Don would like to make this as interactive as we can. So without any more introduction, I'd like to introduce Don and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to ILA and to the Business Member Interest Group for sponsoring the webinar. And good morning, everyone from Sydney, where it's the start of a brand new day on Thursday the 7th. I'd like to acknowledge a couple of people who've had a big hand in developing the ideas in my book, Eva Wilson and Joanne O'Brien-Levin. They presented with me last year at ILA as well. Today we're going to look at 4 topics. The first of them is the proposition that conventional ideas about leadership tend to get bound up in some pretty deep-seated assumptions. One of them is that leadership's essentially an influence process. When we recognise such assumptions and hold them to one side, it becomes possible to see a usefully different form of leadership, one that's otherwise obscured from view. Now, this form is based in learning processes and relational interactions. I'm not trying to throw out conventional forms here, but to offer an alternative to them. The third topic we're going to look at is how learning-centred leadership processes differ from management processes. Now, I reckon this is a difference that matters. Unless we recognise leadership as different, there's a danger it will be overwhelmed by management-oriented action. Now, how can practitioners set about exercising leadership based in learning? Are there tools and frameworks to help? This is the fourth topic. I'll introduce a framework of practices and tools called ARIES for supporting leadership-oriented action. ARIES stands for attending, reflecting, inquiring, expressing and synthesising. Now, I want to give the session a bit of a practical edge as well as a conceptual one, and I'm going to draw on a case story featuring the experience of Michael, a director and treasurer of a golf club. Now, for the story, we need to cast our minds back a little, about 12 months prior to the financial crisis. Michael's worried about his club's financial situation and his inability to get his fellow directors to appreciate just how precarious things are. 2 years ago, the club used most of its finances to fund a redevelopment. The club then borrowed to cover a shortfall in operating revenues, but without any clear plan to repay the debt. Now Michael can see the writing on the wall. He figures the club's got about another 12 to 18 months before it crashes, but only if some hard-hitting financial strategies are put in place. Now the problem he's facing is that he's finding it hard to engage his fellow directors. He wants them to agree to boost revenues by increasing membership fees or imposing a levy, arguing that the club's charges are currently the lowest in their region. He sees limited scope for cost reductions without cutting into the essential fabric of the club. They just don't get it, says Michael to a friend. This board includes some very successful business people. They've got a lot of experience. I've tried several times, using every way I can think of to present the numbers and forecasts and to talk about solutions. But they just tune out when I give them my analysis. Most of them have been on the board too long. Now Michael's dealing with what I call a contentious problem. These problems might involve, for instance, a stalled change initiative, or powerful stakeholders pursuing competing priorities, or a group or individual performance issue where attitudes seem to be a factor. These are problems that can be seen from a variety of perspectives. There's no one correct solution to be turned up. Now in the golf club case, it's probably true that if the club fails to address the financial issues, it's likely to go under at some point. This is one reality, but it's not necessarily the only reality. As we shall see, this is a critical distinction. Now often emotions run pretty strongly with contentious problems, as those involved assert that their particular view is the correct one. But it's not necessarily just a case of two groups disagreeing, as the illustration on the slide suggests. Or people might be relatively silent, not voicing the relevant thoughts and feelings. Important issues or viewpoints might be kept hidden from the group's discussion. Now there's some of this shutting down happening at the golf club. Individual directors have spoken about these issues in the past, but recently they've had little to say on these matters in Michael's presence. Previously the directors have said things like, "The problem's more to do with costs than revenues. We need to look at more radical solutions. We should promote our facilities and services more to our existing members. Oh, we've been through similar problems before and survived. We're wasting our time here. Michael, you're just not listening." We need leadership to work through and make headway with contentious problems, but some of the dominant images of leadership can have the effect of limiting, constraining our understanding of the kinds of leadership needed to deal with such problems. I'd like you to imagine a forest of leadership. There's a variety of trees and shrubs and ground covers representing the hundreds, thousands of leadership's books, articles, tools and frameworks developed over the past 50 years. But as we look more closely, we see that much of the forest is covered with vines. These vines reflect the dominant, or some dominant, assumptions in conventional thinking about leadership. That leadership's equivalent to leaders. Leadership's what leaders do, and only leaders perform leadership. The second one, that leadership involves the the exercise of authority, and thirdly, that leadership is essentially an influence process. Reflecting the tightly bound nature of these vines, we often see leadership portrayed as involving individual leaders in positions of authority, influencing others towards some or other vision of a desired future. Well, what's the problem with this, you might ask? One problem is that the dominance of such images obscures from view other possible ways of constructing leadership. It's as if we're blocked from seeing forms of leadership in which leaders' authority and influence don't figure strongly. You might recall the story from 1994 of the discovery of a tree that became known as the Wallamai pine. Found in a forest about 100 miles from Sydney, this type of tree was until that time thought to exist only in fossilised form. The Wallamai pine has since been propagated. The specimen you can see here is growing at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Now thinking back to the vines of leadership, we don't need to slash these away completely, but if we can hold the vines back, we might be able to see a different tree in the forest of leadership, one based in learning and distinct from management. Maybe we could even grow such a tree in different locations around the world. Well, perhaps we might pause now, Phil, and take some questions.
Sure, thanks, Don. A couple questions coming in. you talked about, let me see, can you tell us about how contentious problems play in a role of your perspective on learning-based leadership versus the other dominant leadership theories you pointed to?
Okay, well, I guess the difference, well, this question kind of anticipates the next section. So rather than answer this fully, could I take this one on notice? I think I'm going to cover it, and I'd probably prefer to cover it in the context of the preparation I've prepared. But essentially, the problem with conventional forms of leadership, and particularly transformational leadership, is that they're not necessarily as effective at getting down into the deeper hidden dimensions of these contentious problems, the hidden viewpoints that people aren't expressing, the undiscussable issues. The danger is that people often play the game. They will say what they think needs to be said. They will indicate commitment when perhaps really what they're doing is complying. Another danger is that with the more transformationally oriented models, you can get the leader really pushing a particular viewpoint, trying to sell or persuade others. There's often a question on the minds of followers as to, how genuine is the leader with the vision? Is there a bit of gamesmanship going on here? No one really knows what's going on, and there's not a mechanism for testing. And I think that's the difference that I'll be talking about in the next part of the presentation. That learning-centered leadership is really about testing what's going on.
Thanks, Don. Maybe real quick, one more. Somebody had mentioned, in your opinion, what are the other dominant issues of leadership that kind of exacerbate or worsen the contentious problems? You mentioned authority influence. What are the other ones you think?
Well, I think another one that I'm going to come to, and this will be the third part of the presentation, is the dominance of what I call the management mode, that we tend to manage these problems often by coming up with, practical actions which could be superficial fixes, which don't necessarily get down into the deeper dimensions of the problems. We tend to avoid, sidestep, skirt around aspects of the problems that create threat or the potential for embarrassment. So we're often on a continual treadmill of patching up solutions rather than engaging deeply with these problems. And often this is called leadership because we confuse leadership and authority, and it's action taken by very senior people in the organisation, people who might be called the leadership team. But we have to ask, what is the process that's in action here, and by what criteria do we call that leadership?
Thanks, Don. We got some interesting questions. Let me ask you one question that came up. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that individuals do not hide, like you were talking about, during a conflict? If the leader of the group is perceived to be uninterested of others' perspective, is it safe for followers to press a leader? Well,
I don't find the leader-follower distinction helpful in this context. As I'll discuss in the next section, what we're talking about is interventions, and anybody can intervene in the leadership mode. It's a style of interacting. Now, you would expect people in more senior levels, or you would hope that they would do more of this work, and everybody has to have regard to the risks involved, but any form of leadership involves a degree of risk-taking. And I guess what I'm encouraging people to do is to have regard to the risks, but if you can practice the skills of learning leadership, then you hopefully become a bit more adept at taking action, making choices, and exercising leadership and not just leaving it to others.
Great. Thanks, Don. I think we can move on from here and bank the rest of the questions for the next break point.
Great, Phil. Well, we'll start now talking about learning-centered leadership, and I'm going to go to a definition. Learning-centered leadership is kind of the higher order part of the framework, if you like. It's the work that a group needs to do over a period of time. It might just be one person doing the interventions, it might be a group of people, but essentially the work involves establishing current realities, clarifying preferred futures, including purpose and vision, and eliciting energy for deep-reaching change. Now, the primary challenge, as I see it here, is to build shared meaning, common understandings about what's real in relation to the problem at present and about what we're trying to achieve and about what the preferred future will look like when it's realised. The learning and learning-centred leadership involves social processes, so it's about people jointly making sense of multiple perspectives. Now, when we construct meaning jointly, energy for change gets released, and that's different to what happens in conventional transformation leadership frameworks, which emphasise leaders influencing and motivating followers. Now, to build shared meaning, it's critical to understand at a deeper level how stakeholders, ourselves included, view the problem now and what the stakeholders aspire to for the future. Now, we can view contentious problems as like an iceberg. So there's the level above the waterline, the explicit or more tangible side, and this represents aspects of the problem that are observable or measurable, as with the golf club's revenue and cost projections, or trends in visitor member numbers, or behaviours that people demonstrate, or even the actual words they use. If we look below the waterline, though, that's the implicit or hidden side of the problem, and that represents what stakeholders have in their hearts and minds, but for whatever reasons they don't state directly. So in the golf club example, it appears from things the other directors have said previously that they've got some concerns, whether it's about the need for a focus on costs more than revenues. But what's implicit here is the thinking and experience behind the concerns that appears not to have been made explicit, made tangible. Now, the hidden side represents an immense well of potential intelligence that can be applied to working through the problem, if we can gain access to it. A learning approach to leadership involves drawing out and working with this latent hidden intelligence and integrating it with the more tangible above the waterline resources. When we work in this way, we not only build shared meaning, we also draw forth energy for change. Recognising shared meaning is not necessarily unanimous agreement. We can still have some differences remaining. We don't have to motivate people as we're tapping into people's natural desire to contribute and make a difference. Now, here's the crunch. Reaching down to draw out hidden mental resources implies threat and defensiveness, since we're getting into territory that people normally keep concealed. If we're going to intervene with problems in ways that harness diversity, yet minimise the negative impacts of threat and defensiveness, we need to intervene relationally. Now, I'll talk about what this means in a minute, but commonly what happens when we're working on problems is we adopt a detached stance. We see the problem out there, separate from ourselves. So you can see here in the slide, Michael is a bit disconnected from the other directors. We tend to operate on the problem and the other people involved with it to achieve our objectives, as Michael has done in trying to convince the other directors of his analysis. When we work relationally, however, we see ourselves as part of the problem rather than standing apart from it. We recognise that our own framing and actions can contribute to the problem we see. We need to hold our own views as open to inquiry. Now, Michael sees the other directors as not getting it, but those directors might in part at least be reacting against Michael's actions, such as his repeated attempts to persuade them of his analysis. Working relationally implies recognising that everyone involved can contribute to developing shared meaning, and that no one, ourselves included, has all the answers. We've got to get down below the waterline, but we have to do so in ways that maintain safety for ourselves and others. Now, this is not just a matter of being nice to people or staying positive. It implies elevating the quality of our interaction above imperatives for task achievement. Intervening relationally generally involves acts of speaking. We might ask questions to learn of others' views or express a personal viewpoint in ways that invite engagement for others. We'll see some examples in a little while as we go into the RE's framework about how this can work in practice. But in the meantime, let me pull this discussion together with a definition of leadership mode work. We act in the leadership mode when we intervene relationally toward building shared meaning in the context of efforts to achieve deep-reaching change with a contentious problem. Now, by deep-reaching change, I mean change at the level of attitudes and mindsets, not just at the surface level as with structures and systems. Now, leadership mode interventions, they're really the nitty-gritty of learning-centred leadership work, and achieving change is likely to require many such interventions over a period. Now, the benefits, when we work this way, we make it possible for more people to be involved in the work of leadership. and that potentially gives us a bigger range of knowledge, experience and understanding to be applied to the problem. Potentially we can access a greater depth of intelligence through intervening in ways that help make it safe for others to surface some of what they would otherwise keep hidden. Now, leadership-based in learning represents one possible approach for intervening with contentious problems. We can also intervene in what I call the management mode. But before we go to that, I'm going to hand back to Phil and see if we've got a couple more questions.
Great, thanks, Don. We do have a couple more questions. Here, let me see. Sharon Parks talks about how there is an ideological view of leadership that is tied with authority, influence, and leading. How can we change this paradigm if everyone is buying into this idea?
I wish I had a quick answer to that one. It's an eternal struggle for me. But I think, look, it's about finding people who are dealing with contentious problems, who perhaps are stuck or blocked in some way. They want a new way in. Sometimes, people who are intellectually curious, who are open to different approaches and who've got a real business or strategic problem, are sometimes curious enough to try something different. To my way of thinking, it's about encouraging people who are willing to give something different a go and supporting them in that practice. And hopefully over time we can cultivate a whole lot of little Wallamai pines of leadership where, we grow, as it were, a new type of leadership. This is not an assault on conventional concepts. It's kind of chipping away, and I don't expect we're going to see the end of ideologically constructed authority-based conceptions tomorrow. We're growing up a different approach.
Great, thanks, Don. One more question we have here. How does the concept of the co-creation of meaning impact a team member or a team when some members may not feel that they truly contribute to that meaning?
Well, I guess if you're somebody who's doing leadership mode intervention, then it's incumbent on you to reality test what's going on for different people in the group. You can make such interventions whether or not you're a person in authority. If you're a member of a group and you feel other people are being excluded or not feeling included in the process, you can raise such a proposition, but do it in ways that minimise threat for others involved and yourself. So non-judgmentally, raise the question. I'm wondering whether everybody here is feeling included. Could we test out how people feel about what's going on? It's about attributing to people a degree of reasonableness. So it's working on the proposition that the person calling the shots maybe actually really does want to get everyone engaged and might appreciate some input to suggest that, that's not necessarily the case at the moment. Now, you don't want to go wading in here making hazardous interventions and creating, risk for everybody, but often thinking about what is the person who's in authority trying to achieve, how can I help them achieve what they want to, how in a way that's true to me and which enables leadership to emerge from the whole group, and then thinking what does that mean in terms of intervention possibilities. And as you get more skilled in this work, you'll probably be able to identify a way forward. But this is a practice game. It takes a fair while to feel comfortable about this work, and there's unfortunately no shortcuts.
I think that you'll cover some of this probably later in the presentation.
We will, indeed.
Another question we have is, how well would authentic leadership theory be the vehicle for learning-centered leadership?
Well, there's an absolute correspondence here, because if you're anything less than 100% authentic, you're playing games. Those games mean that you're not truly in the spirit of learning. If you're not modelling a learning orientation yourself, if you're not being true to yourself, trying to get as much as what matters to you on the table, then, others are probably going to see through what you're doing. You're not going to have a lot of credibility. And here's the crunch point. If you are misunderstood or others misconstrue what you're on about, you don't have much of a place to come from if you're kind of playing games. If you're being authentic, you're being true to your own vision and aspirations and motives, you can then always come back to those and say, well, here's what I was trying to do. Maybe that didn't work well, but here was the intention. Let me have another go at that. So authenticity gives you a really solid foundation for this kind of action. There's a complete correspondence as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, great, thanks. Let's take another question and maybe we can move on from here. How is learning-based leadership different from double-loop learning in your perspective?
Look, I've been inspired by a whole range of theorists in organisational learning and leadership, and Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen, who were behind the double-loop learning concept, were big influences on me. So the kind of learning that we're talking about here really is double-loop. It's questioning not just what's happening, but what's going on below what's happening, which is my understanding of the essence of double-loop learning. So it's very much in that spirit, though I don't use that particular term. We'll come later to the practice of inquiring. That's about how we ask deep-reaching questions safely to surface what's going on in the hidden reaches of the iceberg. That's very much in the double-loop territory.
Don, we have a number of other questions, but we're going to hold off on these questions and circle back around as you move into the next part of your presentation.
Good. Thanks, Phil, and thanks for the questions, folks. I'm enjoying those, and keep them coming in. We're going to move now to look at leadership from we're going to look at the relationship between leadership and management, and the question of how leadership mode action relates to action in the management mode, and why we need to take account of the difference. Now, just before I come to the content of the slide, let me just emphasize, this is about process. All this learning-centered leadership work is really about process. It's not about trying to distinguish leaders and managers. That's really a bit of a dead-end street. For one thing, managers tend to come off second best in such comparisons. They're often portrayed as doing the foot soldier work, while leaders are credited with the more glamorous work of visioning and bringing about change. So a process focus enables us to think, well, what is the management-oriented process and what's the leadership one, and how do they intersect? They're not mutually exclusive. There's a degree of overlap. But let's now look at management mode work. So there are three characteristics, as you can see on the slide. Firstly, we focus on the explicit or tangible aspects of the problem, the measurable, concrete aspects, like the golf club revenues or the numbers of members, or the policies we've got about attracting new members, or whatever it might be. We put the task ahead of working relationally. So it's driven by task attainment. This doesn't mean that we're disregardful of relationship questions. It's not about having no regard for people. Modern management's all about valuing people, and this is true to that spirit. But essentially, it's about putting task prior to relationship. The third element is a focus or a reliance on authority. We rely on the authority that we bring to the position we hold, so that Michael, in the golf club case, he has the authority of the treasurer, and that's really what enables him to raise the kinds of questions he's raising. Let's try and give this a bit of a practical edge by applying the three characteristics of management mode action to the golf club case. Let's say that Michael decides to develop a new financial plan. He brings in a consultant to undertake a review of his analysis and projections and to make recommendations to the board about strategies. Now, what makes this characteristic of management mode action is that Michael is focusing on explicit aspects of the problem, the financial plan, consultants, strategies and the like. He's giving priority to task over relationship here, insofar as he's developing a financial plan, bringing in a consultant. These are task aspects. And again, he's relying on his authority as treasurer. Now, let's look at the two modes together, side by side. So we can see, just to quickly recap on the definitions, the management mode involves a focus on the explicit, tangible aspects of a problem and on considerations of task as prior to relationship in a particular setting. This is not about being task-oriented as an individual. It's what you do in a particular moment, and you're working in that moment from authority. When you're in the leadership mode, you're intervening relationally towards building shared meaning in the context of efforts towards deep-reaching change with a contentious problem. Now, it's not a matter of one of these modes being better than the other. We can potentially identify both leadership and management actions with just about any contentious problem. Back at the golf club, Michael presumably needs to take leadership management mode action As treasurer, he needs to tackle the concrete aspects of the club's finances. He wants to help secure the club's future. This does require management action. This is important. We're not underplaying it. But management action alone is unlikely to be sufficient. That is, if he wants real change to come about in the way the board's facing the problems. And that's because unless he engages in leadership mode work as well, he's unlikely to get down below the waterline and deal with those concerns that the board members have that they're perhaps not being forthright about. So Michael's going to need to learn about those perspectives to join with the board members in working through the issues, and this does require leadership. And the benefit, well, you get the experience, the insights, the energy, the commitment that at least some of these other directors have to help overcome the problems. Leadership and management are different. They're not opposites. And there are no neat divides between them, as the grey space on the slide indicates. There's invariably some ambiguity at the interface. We sometimes find people's actions indicating or suggesting both elements of leadership and management. We can't always make a clear call as to which mode we're in, but the ambiguity shouldn't stop us recognising the differences. It's not a matter of going down one path, leadership or management, to the exclusion of the other. If we've developed the capability to do so, we can move between them as circumstances require. If we can develop proficiency in both leadership and management, we strengthen our capability to make an intervention that's called for in a particular moment. Another benefit is we can assess how much attention we're giving to leadership and how much to management. Now, this is an important consideration because, well, in my experience at least, I don't know about yours, in most organisations, the leadership-management complementarity is a potential to be tapped rather than a present reality. It's often the case that, in fact, management-oriented action seems to completely overwhelm leadership. As the figure suggests, it's as if leadership is eclipsed by management. Now, various drivers contribute to this state of affairs. Just quickly, you get pressures such as accountability and compliance requirements, driving a focus on explicit and task aspects. Apart from that, many people derive much of their satisfaction at work from being able to tick off completed tasks. The leadership mode works a bit more nebulous. The benefits take time to become apparent. But perhaps the most important factor is the tendency to avoid threat and the risk of embarrassment. Leadership mode work can be scary. We're delving into territory that many people would rather left unexamined. Threats inevitable. But, as we'll see shortly, there are ways of minimising these effects. So why do we need to disentangle leadership and management? Well, we've seen many of the pressures reinforcing the dominance of management mode practice, but there are also strong social expectations that organisations give attention to leadership and its development, whatever that might mean to them. A danger is that leadership comes to be seen through and this is a dominant lens, a management mode lens. Leadership can become an espoused value, one that's talked about much more than practiced. We need to identify leadership mode work as distinct from management if we're to give it the attention it needs. Now, most of us have opportunities to intervene in the leadership mode. A challenge is to notice those opportunities and consciously choose to act on them. We don't need to constantly do this, but hopefully we do it from time to time. Making such choices is easier if we have a set of practices and tools to help us. And in the next segment, we'll go to the ARIES framework, which is in part 2 of the book In the Leadership Mode. Now, Phil, it's back to you for some more questions.
Don, I like this. Going back and forth.
Good, good.
Except for 10 a.m. my time and midnight your time, so I'm a little more awake.
Okay, 25 to 1. I'm going to crash at the end of this, yep.
Yeah. Okay, here we go. What do you do when you're coming in as an outsider to fix the problem? You are seen as the other by the other directors. How do you build those relational bridges?
Okay, well, you always work from observation, and that can be, it's about observing what's going on in the external environment and also including what's going on in your own mind. This is an important principle. Work from observation, attribute reasonableness to other people, so regard the other directors as reasonable, and be authentic. So you can surface the fact, hey guys, I'm new here, people may not know where I'm coming from, I don't know a lot about the organisation as yet, we're going to experience some uncertainty, I'm going to be feeling that, perhaps you are as well, we need to build bridges, I want to do that. let's work in that spirit. So you're constantly working with what you can observe. If you feel a little apprehensive because you're new, surface that, make it testable. It's true, it's observable to you, it's in your consciousness. Get it out there, reveal it, not in a dogmatic kind of way, but just float it and invite reactions. I'm new here. I'm feeling, it's going to take me a bit of time to get the hang of the place. What's your reaction to this? What do you see? What concerns does my being new raise for you?
Thanks, Don. Another question we have here, what is the method by which leaders and followers develop shared meaning, and how can personal perceptions be overcome so as to achieve greater alignment in the shared meaning?
Okay, well, the process for achieving shared meaning is through lots and lots of interventions done relationally to try and build shared meaning, using the RE's framework that we're about to come to. At least, I'm not saying this is the only way of doing it, but it's my way of doing it, and keeping in mind these essential ground rules that I've just mentioned, which are work from observation, declare your data, attribute to others reasonableness. So work on the basis that people are reasonable or capable of being reasonable in this instance, even when they might not seem to be. So it's kind of allowing that even an otherwise unreasonable person might be capable of some reasonableness now, and then think about what your motives are. What are you trying to do here? Are you being true to your motives, or are you playing a game? If you're playing a game, then you've got to do a bit of reality check with yourself. And the leaders and followers thing, look, I'm not saying don't use those terms, but I find them problematic because it kind of locates leadership with the leader, not with the followers. My orientation is more towards a dispersed form of leadership. It's allowing that leadership can come from anywhere. It doesn't reside just with formal leaders. So let's distinguish between leaders as role occupants, as individuals perhaps with particular qualities, and leadership as process. It's the process focus that I'm trying to give a bit of emphasis to here.
I think you may have answered a question somebody put in, but basically they wrote in, then everyone in the group must realize that they are leaders within the group and that their ideas have value and meaning.
Well, there's no requirement that happen. You can't ordain that people will recognize this, but you're trying to create a context in which people feel safe to intervene and feel safe to exercise leadership. Ultimately people come to their own conclusions about whether it's safe to do this or not, and often it's just one or two people doing the work of learning-centered leadership. You're trying to make it safe for other people, but you're recognizing not everyone's going to come to the table, and you don't consider this work a failure if some people hold back. That's the reality of the workplace.
We have a number of questions. Let me take one more, and we can get in the last part. Is the leadership mode about the incorporation of ethics in the leadership process? For example, is it right that leadership and the future are only about an individual's leadership vision, or should leadership be about seeing the right collaborative vision?
Okay, look, there are times when you're a person in authority and you feel, for whatever reason, you just have to press ahead with your vision. We did a case like this I did with Eva Wilson and Joanne O'Brien-Levin at ILA last year. The case drew on Eva's experience as a CEO at Philips Display Components. She just knew, she felt she had to press ahead with a restructure to move to a 4-shift operation in her plant. It was the only way she could see of maintaining viability. The question, I suppose, as it emerged for her was the way she went about implementing that process. So sometimes it's not going to be a collaborative vision. Eva coined the term leadership in the management mode. So it's kind of a person in a formal position of leadership, but perhaps they're acting more in the management mode in a particular instance. They're focusing on the explicit aspects of the problem. We've got to get viability. We have to introduce 4 shifts. They're pushing the task thing. They're relying on their authority. Sometimes you've got to do that. The collaborative stuff doesn't always, there's not always the opportunity to work in the more collaborative mode. You need to move between different modes. The main thing is to be conscious of the choices you're making.
Great. I think a lot of people of our consultants have kind of experienced what you've seen there. Let's move on to the last part, and let's answer the remainder of the questions after we get done through the last part of your presentation.
Great, Phil. I'm going to have to move fairly quickly through the last part so we don't run out of time, but here we go with the RE's framework: attending, reflecting, inquiring, expressing, and synthesizing. I'm going to talk about them each in turn. They refer to a set of practices and a set of tools. Now, the book in the leadership mode describes these in a chapter on each of them, both at the level of practice and tools. There's a whole bunch of tools described in the book that we just don't have time to look into tonight, I'm afraid, including really detailed methodologies for getting down into the practice of inquiry, the practice of expressing. But we'll have a kind of a quick scoot through them tonight, or this morning I should say for most of you. Attending. Now, in the practice of attending, we can make a distinction between the usual concept of paying attention, which is more of a management mode kind of idea, where we're trying to achieve our own objectives. Attention in that context is sort of instrumental. It's in the service of achieving what we want to do. That's different from what I'm talking about with attending in the leadership mode. We're really talking about a different dimension where we're putting the quality of our perceiving ahead of task attainment. We're trying to stay alert to the surrounding context, to tune in very deeply to those that we're working with, trying to pick up faint signals, diverging voices, and disconfirming data. In particular, we're trying to differentiate our perceptions from the inferences and conclusions we draw from those perceptions. And this is kind of really hard to do. So in Michael's case, let's just take a quick example. Michael notices that the other directors are shuffling papers and talking when he's trying to talk to them about the financial problems facing the club. He thinks to himself, look, the other directors are reluctant to change. They've been on the board for too long. Well, the notion that the directors are talking amongst themselves and shuffling papers, that's observable. But if we attribute explanations to people, like they've been on the board too long, we're getting into inference. We need to really come back to observation, because any one observation can give rise to lots of inferences. So let's be clear about what we perceive directly and how that is different from the inference we make. And that's probably the first rule of the attending practice. I'm going to jump on here to reflecting. Now, reflecting in the management mode and conventionally is about drawing on past experience to make sense of current problems. So Michael at the golf club might think about previous times when the clubs faced financial difficulties and about what they did then and what can be learned from that experience. That's all good and useful, and I have no quarrel with that, but reflecting in the leadership mode has a different quality. We're trying to make sense here of differing stakeholder perceptions about present problems. Now, there's a structure in the book in the leadership mode that identifies 4 dimensions of the hidden domain: hidden assumptions, interests, feelings, and knowledge. And there's a tool there called the reflection matrix. What we're trying to do there is sketch out a kind of a story to explain what might be going on for the various stakeholders with an interest in the problem, including ourselves. We're trying to develop a kind of a possible narrative, a multi-textured, multifaceted narrative that draws on the possible stakeholder perspectives to inform our understanding of the issue. Now, we're really just developing hypotheses. This is a critical element. They're hypotheses that we can then test to make sense of and to validate. Now, to just very quickly, some examples with Michael and the golf club. Pardon me. A hidden interest, for example, of the other directors might be in protecting some aspects of the club they've come to value over time. Maybe they're feeling, hidden feeling. Perhaps they're feeling frustrated with aspects of Michael's approach, as with pushing his analysis and his desire to raise revenues. Perhaps they've got hidden knowledge, unexpressed knowledge from past financial problems they've faced and how those have been overcome, or from their wider business experience, given they're experienced business people. So reflecting here is about understanding what hypothesizing what might be going on. There's both an individual and a collective dimension to this. We can do this work individually. We can do it as part of a group. But we're, in a sense, gathering data that we can use then to inform questions we might ask or things we might say. The questioning component kicks us into the inquiring practice. And here we've got, again, a differentiation from management mode work. So in the management mode, we're trying to, we're focusing on tasks, the explicit aspects of the problem, using authority. Often we're trying to solve problems as the expert. We're looking for the solution. How do I find my way out of the maze, to reference the picture in on the slide there. But when we're doing leadership mode inquiring, we're trying to deepen our understandings. We're using questions relationally to build shared meaning. We're going down deeper into the problem. Now, there's a whole set of questions in the book, types of questions about how to do this. Let me just, I'll just give you one example so we can speed through. Testing questions. Now, testing questions involve putting information or inferences to others and inviting a response. So, for example, Michael might say to the other directors, I've noticed that when I present my analysis, and particularly when I suggest that we need to raise fees and charges, that some of you have appeared to me to be distracted, for example, in shuffling papers or looking away. I'm inferring that you're disagreeing with my approach. Please tell me if this is the case, and if so, what is it that you object to? So he's checking out his inference that they're distracted, that they don't agree with him, and he's then trying to find out what's true for them. Again, we'd be building here on work that we've done in the attending and reflecting practices. What makes this a testing question is that we're seeking a response to an inference, something that we've come up with as a way of fostering learning for ourselves and others. Now, as with all this work, this is hard stuff. We've got to be in the moment. We've got to be very present. We've got to avoid getting hijacked with our own agendas. It's to be really true to what's going on in the moment, sensing where other people are at, sensing where you're at, and thinking what's the question that's called for here, and then being able to ask that. This requires quite a bit of practice and quite a bit of skill to do it well, but you've got to start somewhere, and I think we can all make a start with this. If we go to the next practice, which is expressing, again, this is not about advocating, not about trying to win or to persuade others to your point of view. It's voicing what's true for you about the problem relationally, so you're locating your views within a wider context, you're recognizing your own views as one of many perspectives on the problem, not about compromising the strength of your own convictions. It's fine to give voice in a forthright manner to your core beliefs, but with issues it's about recognizing, well, there are lots of perspectives here. I've got one perspective. I can articulate my perspectives confidently, but hold open a little bit of doubt, allow that there are other perspectives, and let other voices in. Now, there's a 5-point framework in the book for how to develop a presentation on an issue that you need to put your views forward on, which is difficult to do. One of the aspects is disclosing. Let me give you a quick example from the golf club case about how Michael might disclose something for him. If he's aware that he's feeling a bit frustrated with the other director's reluctance to tune into the problems he sees, he might say something like, look, I sense we're all feeling frustrated with issues relating to the club's finances. For me, it's frustrating that some of you, my fellow directors, many of whom are, or a few of whom are experienced business people, don't seem to get the reality of our financial situation. I'm finding that hard to figure, but perhaps I'm missing something here. And I suspect you might be feeling some frustration with my repeated efforts to put the issue before the table. So maybe we need to talk about this frustration thing and what it means to each of us, and try and do that in a collaborative way. So the challenge here, relational action, is to name your own feelings, but locate that more broadly. Allow some recognition of what others might be feeling too, and in that spirit you're more likely to get others to join with you and less likely to give rise to threat and defensiveness. I sense we're running out of time rapidly, so I'm going to jump to the synthesizing practice. Synthesizing is not about making judgments, summing up, evaluating, or pronouncing a correct view. It's about integrating, forging together diverse perspectives to create, a fresh understanding of the problem, or a novel understanding, or a more developed understanding, in which we bring together the various perspectives on current reality, the various perspectives on vision, and we try and hold those and again enable testing on them. Now there are 4 specific types of synthesizing intervention described in the book. One of these is what I call the transformational challenge, which is a naming of vision and current reality and holding that out to people in a way where you invite feedback. So you're trying to name vision and current reality in a way that you think might reflect other views amongst stakeholders, and you're holding that out for testing. Now, I'm going to pause there, Phil, and go back to some more questions. I could do a bit of a summing up, but I think that's going to take time that's better given over to questions. So let me go to our Wallamai Pine sign, which is the sort of flag that, we're at the end of a section. And Phil, it's over to you.
Right. We're going to try to get through these questions as quickly as possible. There's a number of them. But also, if your question does not get answered today, feel free to email Don directly. He told us that he'd be happy to receive those questions and would be getting back to you. So
yep,
first question we have here is, should the hierarchical model of leadership become flatter in the workplace?
Well, maybe it should, but that's not a challenge that I'm engaging with. Okay, this is not about creating flatter organisations in my schema. This is about working to achieve intelligent outcomes to contentious problems. Now, it may be that the sort of height of the hierarchy is a problem you want to intervene with, in which case you can apply these methodologies to that problem. But it's not a problem per se. It's about recognising that we need to get leadership mode action going across the hierarchy and to develop skills and capabilities to intervene both up the line and down the line from wherever you sit in the organisation. So if you want to intervene with your manager, maybe it's about saying, hey, I've got a difficult issue I want to talk about. This is difficult to me because of the authority differential. There might be some things that I'd want to talk about which perhaps are not topics that at your level are really on the agenda. Can you hold open that we could have a bit of a talk about those? So you really seek to open up a space in which you can intervene. Likewise, if you're working with people at lower levels in the hierarchy, you might flag and make explicit whatever difficulties you see that makes. Perhaps it's difficult for you to respond on this issue to me because you're worried about authority differentials. Here's my take on that. I invite your input, and I want to put aside questions of authority or take off my kind of authority hat here. So we're trying to get the emphasis in leadership action on processes, and we're really almost redefining authority in relation to leadership, in that we are locating authority as being more to do with management mode interventions than leadership ones. Now that's kind of an interesting prospect, and we could talk about that for quite a bit, but I better allow another questioning.
Yeah. Okay. So this one's a little bit long, but I think it's a good question. In the golf club case, you're talking about how to switch into the leadership mode with the board of directors. It seems emotional intelligence is a big part of this in order to step out of the management mode. How does this relate to the fact that often boards are made up of very task-oriented individuals, probably part of the reason they were selected?
Well, that's true, and it's an interesting question. Look, I recently had an experience doing a coaching exercise with a CEO who was trying to raise a difficult issue with her own board, and she was getting very little engagement from them. So in the coaching process, we talked about how she could handle that, and essentially she talked about what was true for her in the experience with the board. She surfaced the fact that she needed to work with her board colleagues. She was finding this difficult. This wasn't an adverse judgment about the board members, but it was it was being true to what she needed and wanted, what she observed in their interplay, what she thought their concerns might be. So we went through the various practices. We figured out what was actually observable here, what was data that she could work with. We talked about the reflecting process to identify what might be going on for the other stakeholders. We used some of that data helped her identify some questions she could ask. She asked those questions of the board, she expressed her views relationally, and in the very next meeting she actually got the kind of outcome she wanted. So in her case at least, it was possible to overcome the sort of task-oriented nature of the directors. You know, we have to be careful not to package people up and come to a conclusion that we're not going to get anywhere with them. Again, it's coming back to this idea of reasonableness. Let's allow the possibility that in this context we might make some progress that up until now we haven't thought possible.
Great. We're going to take one last question and then we're going to wrap up. What is the process we can do to integrate diverse perspectives? How does a leader do this in the leadership, the learning-based leadership process that you described?
Okay, well, you use the ARIES framework. You work from observation, you work from data, you think about what's really going on for all of those people in the group, you think about good questions to ask to get the issue down into the hidden reaches below the surface of the iceberg, you express your views relationally. You look to the whole problem, you locate your views within the larger whole, you reveal some of what matters to you that you might not have otherwise said, you do so non-judgmentally, you keep open the reasonableness principle, you make sure you're not playing games, that you're being true to what matters, you look for opportunities to integrate different perspectives, to find common ground, and you keep the whole thing testable and dynamic. And you make judgment calls as you go about what's safe and what's risky, and you pull back if it gets risky, find another opportunity to come in again. Phil, just before you close out, can I reinforce the idea that I'm really keen to get input from people? You can email me, even just send a sort of one-liner in the subject line about your interest, and I hope to get into a conversation with people over the next few weeks. The ILA Space site is a good way, and I've got a presence just established there so we can interact on that one. The book's available out there on the internet. So, Phil, I'm not giving you much time to close out, but back to you.
Thanks, Don. And, of course, more details, more questions, send an email to Don, and also pick up the book. I'm sure you can find a lot of the answers to your questions there. I would like to close out by thanking Don for coming, and the Business MIG sponsoring it. I think is a worthwhile webinar. We really appreciate him having on now that it's 1 o'clock in the morning, your time. Just to let everybody know that the rebroadcast of this webinar will be available on ILA website within 48 hours after the closing. Everyone will receive email about this. Like Don said, we have a new ILA community on ILA Space, which we encourage discussion after this webinar to take place. And then lastly, I want to remind everybody the next webinar in the 2009 ILA series is going to be presented by Harvey Steisler on transformational Prague, art, history, and it's going to be a great primer for the 2009 ILA conference in Prague. And this is going to be happening, take place June 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and we look forward for everybody attending that one. I think it'll be a great preview to the conference we're going to be having in Prague coming in November. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Don, so much for staying up so late, and we look forward to seeing everybody.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed it. And thanks to Josh Tarr, too, from ILA for organising this.
Yep. Thanks, Josh.